we can start our lesson, which is the first one in which we have a prestigious professor coming from the University of Indiana, distinguished professor GERARD MAGLIOCCA, which was last year visiting professor at the University of Bologna exactly in this course. And so he comes back again, and we hope to see him again in person in Bologna next year. But today, he is here for this particularly interesting lesson, which is city must drive self-driving vehicles. This lesson is very interesting because lead us toward the world of self-driving car on one end, but on the other end, I think that this lesson will stress the importance of all the environment which surround the prospective driverless car. So thank you very much, Gerard, for this lesson. And also, I think that it will also speak about something which in some ways join us. So the link, which is with Professor Guido Calabresi, which was many times here for lessons, for Lectio Magistralis years, and which made us in touch, and so also inspired many studies which we developed over time. And so I thank you very much for this precious contribution. Also, Daniele Senzani is here in class, and he tell you perhaps you like to come for a while, just for a while to yeah.
Hi, Gerard. I'm happy to see you again.
Yes,
Thank you for being here with us, and I'm very interested in listening to you and your speech on this today. All right? So, all the best. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Grazie. Ciao. Ciao.
Thank you. Also, all friends from Bologna here, Matteo and other person which you knew last year. And so now I give you the floor for the speech. We have a lot of persons which are extremely interested and curious. And so perhaps after the end of your Lectio Magistralis, we can start a question time with the students which are here. And so thank you very much again, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Grazie, Professor Mureden. Very nice to see all of you again. You're hearing me all right?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, buongiorno to all of you in the audience. I have very fond memories of my time there last year, and just to show that I have the my insignia here for all of you to see. And last year I spoke about the sort of private law aspects of regulating self-driving vehicles, including contract and tort. And this year, I thought I would talk about more of a public law focus on the question, and specifically the role that cities can play in sort of leading the way in determining the best way to regulate the self-driving vehicle industry. Now, I should start with a bit of a personal story, which is to say that I own a Tesla, and recently they made available on my Tesla for free the self-driving capability, because normally you have to pay quite a bit for it, and it's not something I've ever gotten. And so I was hoping to try it out for the first time before this presentation. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that, so I may actually end up doing it immediately following this presentation, in part because now I am thinking about these questions again. But you see, one thing that's interesting about that, which I'll talk about as I go into my remarks, is that even for someone like me who has spoken about this subject before and has talked about it with students here in my classes when I teach private law, I'm still a little nervous about trying it for the first time, right? Because, and I don't live in a big city with a lot of traffic and the other kinds of issues that you might think would make it more complicated to use a self-driving vehicle. It's just that, well, it's just going to be very different. And there's a certain comfort level that we all have to reach for any new technology, right? But especially one that involves our personal safety, safety of family members, and so on. So I am going to try it, but at the same time, I think a lot of people are asking a lot of questions about the safety, the effectiveness of these vehicles. And so one of the questions that regulators are going to have to grapple with is how to balance that legitimate concern against the need to drive the technology forward because of all the benefits that it will bring once it is widely adopted, and also to think about kind of how best to balance those things. So perhaps I'll have a different perspective on this after I take my car for my car takes me for a drive. But for now, what I want to sort of make as my theme today is that cities, not countries or states and provinces, should be taking the lead in regulating self-driving vehicles. And this is an assertion I'm going to make around the globe, that cities around the globe should be taking the lead. And I'm going to explain that first by talking about the role that cities typically play in regulating vehicles or regulating driving, and then talk more specifically about why there's a particular reason to think that having cities take the lead would be especially suitable and beneficial for self-driving or autonomous vehicles. Okay, so let me begin by stating something that I think you will all agree with, which is typically cities play a significant role in regulating traffic and driving. It is not something that is handled initially or for the most part by national governments or regional governments. Now, I'll give you a simple example. My understanding is that since I was there last year, Bologna has imposed a much stricter speed limit within the city, which I understand everybody loves. No, that's a joke. But the point being, that's the kind of decision that cities make all the time. And you would think that first, city officials would be in the best position to make such decisions because they're familiar with local conditions. And second, it's relatively easy for people in that city to decide that they don't like some new policy like that, and they can make their objections known, either through protests or perhaps municipal elections where they might say vote out the mayor or vote out other local officials if they really don't like particular policies about driving, because of course that's going to have a significant impact on the everyday lives of people in that city. Okay, now think about all the other ways in which municipalities regulate traffic or things related to driving. Parking rules. Parking rules are almost always set at the local level. Traffic enforcement is often done by local police or local officials, making all sorts of decisions about when is it appropriate to give someone some sort of ticket or citation, when do we need to make a more serious kind of charge, perhaps a criminal charge against someone for reckless driving or something like that. All those decisions tend to be handled locally. What about signs along the roads? What about traffic lights or regulations that may have to do with pedestrian crossings or zones where you don't allow vehicles at all because, for example, okay, I understand also since I was there last, right, that the towers are now due torri are closed for renovation, and so they've had to somehow change the traffic pattern around them. Okay, again, that's going to be taken at the local level, at least initially. I mean, you can't imagine someone else getting involved for some other reason, financial, for example. Okay, what about tolls? You know, if certain cities may have tolls that they impose because you have to cross a bridge to get over a river or something like that. Then there are also municipal vehicles of all sorts that cities regulate. That could be things that government officials use, say ambulances, fire vehicles, police vehicles, right? Those are all in some sense going to be either owned or operated by a city. Sanitation, right? Vehicles to dispose of garbage and waste of all sorts. What about regulation of taxis and other sort of vehicles that might be involved in tourism, might be involved in just everyday kind of people getting around a locality? Okay, those are all subjects which are typically handled by cities, no matter where you are in the world. Okay, now, I say that because, first, we often take that for granted. I mean, even in thinking about this lecture, I had to pause and reflect a bit about, well, yeah, exactly what is the role of the local government in the town that I live in with regard to driving and traffic. And you quickly realize that, well, it's very considerable. Indeed, it might be one of the most significant things that local government does. I mean, they obviously also provide other basic services, but you could say, well, that's a big part of the regulatory function of a local government. But because we're just sort of accustomed to that, and it's not political, typically, it's right more of a technical, administrative function of government, we don't maybe think about it as much as we might think about questions about taxes or spending or foreign policy and so on. Okay, now, if I've convinced you that this is generally true, that cities are regulating vehicles and driving typically, right, then it follows that for self-driving vehicles, cities ought to be in the lead because it's just another component of driving and traffic regulation that they do. So the starting premise is, okay, since cities typically regulate in this area, we would also expect or think it appropriate for them to regulate self-driving aspects of these same vehicles, same traffic, and so on. Okay, so that's my general point. All right, now, okay, but perhaps you could say, or some of you may be thinking, well, but self-driving vehicles are different because they represent a very significant change, not only in the technology, but also in how it's going to affect daily life and all sorts of other issues. And so it should be something of an exception to this idea that cities regulate driving. And self-driving aspects should be handled at a higher level, regional or national. Okay, but I think that's wrong. And I think actually the evidence points the other way, that we really have even more reason to think that cities should regulate vehicles or be involved in that for the most part, rather than less. So let me explain several reasons why I think that is true. Okay, so first, cities differ widely in their openness or sort of the ease with which you can have self-driving vehicles. Now let's take a simple example. Some cities get snow, others don't. That might be a factor that you'd think about in terms of how you would want to regulate self-driving cars or vehicles initially. Weather conditions that are more difficult might pose more of a problem for the self-driving vehicles than a city with weather conditions that are typically pretty standard. It's sunny, it's dry, or if it rains, it's not very much. So right away, the thought that a particular country, which has very different sort of weather patterns within it, or different regions, some warmer, some colder, would want to have a national level policy about self-driving cars seems problematic. In some, there might be greater safety concerns than in others. Okay, weather is one factor, right? Another factor would be geography. Some cities are flat, others are very hilly. That also might play a role in how we would think about the degree to which the self-driving vehicle would have difficulty adapting or learning how to function. And that in turn might lead some cities to want to make different decisions for safety reasons and other reasons about how self-driving vehicles can operate rather than others. Okay, we can think of road conditions. Some cities have roads that are more, well, not in as good a shape, more holes, more problems than others. That might also lead to a certain kind of question about how self-driving vehicles should be allowed, when they should be allowed, where they should be allowed, right? In a way that no national or regional government could capture. Okay, traffic patterns. I mean, some cities have significant traffic problems, right? Congestion. They may feel very differently about self-driving vehicles, whether to allow them at all, right? Or to only allow them at certain times of the day or certain places where the traffic congestion is not as much of a problem. Other cities don't have that sort of traffic problem, okay? You could add also that different cities might have different attitudes about climate change and the degree to which they think that self-driving vehicles either contribute or don't to that question. Okay, so look, the sort of adaptability or sort of fit between a particular city and self-driving vehicles is going to vary widely from city to city. And only the cities themselves can really thoughtfully work through that kind of question. Do we need it? How much do we need it? What limits do we have to have? And how is that all going to work? So to have a national or regional attempt to either have one policy for all cities would be a problem, or for authorities outside of those cities to try to assess the different conditions in their nation, in their region, and how suitable they are for self-driving vehicles. That also seems like not the best approach. So that's one reason to think that we should have city determinations on these questions, because cities have widely different sort of relationships, or will have widely different relationships to driving in a way that wouldn't be true, for example, for flying, right? In other words, you can imagine airports are much more similar from city to city. And you would think also that airports are much more amenable to national regulation, because flights are typically going across that country or internationally, right? So it's a totally different thing to think about, say, airline regulation than to think about vehicle regulation. And you might say the same, by the way, for ships as well, because of course there are self-driving boats, and that's also a fast developing area of technology. Okay, now, second thought is cities should take the lead because we need a lot of local infrastructure to be able to further the development of self-driving cars. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, consider that something simple like signage. Okay, so a human driver, right, can observe signs telling that person when to stop, when to go, what the speed limit is, whether there's some sort of other restriction, you're near a school, you're somewhere where you have to exercise caution because they're doing work in the road, whatever. There's a lot of signage that fulfills that function. Okay, well, the self-driving car is not going to be able to kind of read signs, that is road signs, in the way that a human driver can. So there has to be some substitute for that, right? Now, one substitute, of course, is to say, well, you could make the signs, and indeed we already do this, right, to make the signs different shapes in order to help people understand what they're trying to tell you, right? So if it's, you make it a triangle versus a square versus something else, okay, even a self-driving vehicle would be able to recognize that difference and understand that the sign is saying something else. But in some cases, that's not going to be enough, and you're really going to need something that the self-driving car can detect, like some kind of sensor is going to have to convey the information, for example, as to what the speed limit is in a particular area, or what a particular sign might be talking about, because it isn't sort of obvious from just the shape, size, configuration, okay? So some of that is going to require local governments to invest in new signage or better signage, new traffic lights, different traffic lights, and so on, in order to facilitate self-driving vehicles. And so since local governments are going to have to spend money on that, and they're going to have to be, in effect, in charge of understanding where to place these things and what to remove, that offers another reason to think that they need to be the ones making the decisions in the first instance about what should be done. Okay, now, second, look, think about issues like parking or drop-offs, right? So, for example, one hope for self-driving vehicles is that it will reduce the need for parking in the future, right? Because in theory, the self-driving car could drop you off at work, drop you off at home, drop you off at wherever you're going, and then go back to its original parking space, right? Rather than having to need parking near where you are. Because at whatever point, say, so for example, you drive to work, you could send your car home, then sometime later in the day, you summon the car back to pick you up, right? Okay, but in order for that kind of thing to work, you would need to have some sort of pickup or drop-off zones that are going to be set aside for these self-driving vehicles to go. So the car is going to come in front of a building, pick up someone, and drive off somewhere else, right? Okay, but that has to be planned in some sense, right? Much in the way that some places now might have a designated place for Ubers. And you say, okay, this is an Uber pickup space or zone as distinct from where you get a bus or a taxi or some other vehicle at the airport or train station. Okay, but again, how can those things be done except by local governments, right? Local governments have to be the ones that are going to say, okay, look, you know, we anticipate that there will be more self-driving vehicles that will need to drop people off at the train station. And so, okay, we need to have a zone for that. And then we need to also maybe have things like a time limit, you know, to say, okay, look, the self-driving car can't just sit there for an hour in the zone, much as you maybe cannot, say, have your car parked in a place where it can't park, or try to pick up people in a place where it can't be just sitting there waiting. Okay, so there are going to have to be rules for that. And there's also going to have to be some local enforcement of that, which might involve towing a car. I don't know what a self-driving car will think about being towed. I mean, it does eventually start to raise some questions about the self-awareness of the artificial intelligence, right? Like, I don't want to be towed. So, oh, it's nice to see the room, by the way, since that's the room I was in last year. So, okay, great. No, so the point is, okay, local infrastructure is going to have to be established, funded, planned in order to have more self-driving vehicles. That also, by the way, would be further true if you assume that the self-driving vehicles will be mostly electrical or hybrid, and therefore you're going to need more charging stations, and perhaps there is also going to come a point where there will be, in effect, ways for the self-driving car to want to go charge itself. I should add, two things in this respect. One is, it so happens that not far from my house here in Indiana, they are building the first electric charging road in the United States. So basically, they're going to have wireless chargers along this stretch of highway. And the idea being that any electric vehicle that passes along this highway will be wirelessly charged as you drive. And this is an experiment, another experiment I hope I get to try soon. And okay, but let's say that either becomes more of a common model for charging, or let's say it's more like you set up a station for charging where the electric vehicle will go and charge itself while it's waiting for you to take you to wherever you're going to go next, something like that. Okay, but again, all of that's going to have to be built out by local governments. You can't just put a charger anywhere. You can't just put a wireless charging road anywhere. All of those decisions have to be made and planned out. And so again, local government's going to need to be doing this infrastructure. Okay, now, a third thing to point out in this respect. Self-driving vehicles are not going to work widely unless there is a lot of public education. You can imagine, I don't know if any of you have yet seen a driverless car driving, but say imagine whatever the first time is that you see one, you will probably find that a little, well, uncomfortable, right? Especially if you're walking along and the self-driving car is going to come up sort of next to you, or it's coming toward you, you're crossing the road and it's coming, right? I think you'll be not so sure that it's going to stop, right? Or a little worried about what's going on. Okay, multiply that over many, many people within a city, within a community, and you can see a couple of difficulties that will come up. I mean, one is that, well, people might not be that happy about the prospect of these driverless cars going around. And that might lead to a lot of angry feeling being directed at whoever is the company or person who owns and operates the vehicle. Second is, you could just understand in general that if other drivers or pedestrians or bicyclists are not sure how to respond to the self-driving vehicle, there probably will be more accidents, right? Because people just be some startled, or perhaps because the self-driving vehicle is going to make certain assumptions about how people are going to respond, right? Which then don't actually come to pass. So you cannot widely introduce self-driving vehicles without a significant public education campaign. Explain to people exactly what they are, what the rules are, what makes us think that these things are safe, what happens if something goes wrong, what is the responsibility of the person if, in the car, right, which we'll get to in a second, when there is someone in the car. Now, those kinds of campaigns for public education are much more likely to be effective at the local level. You can imagine a national education drive, much like you saw maybe during the pandemic, where you just have national officials sort of going out and putting out literature and doing public sessions, things on television and so on, to sort of explain or describe what's going on. But probably a lot of those things happen better in communities, local communities, and perhaps a pandemic might be an example of this, in the sense of, you might think that to educate people about a vaccine, you have to actually do that at a level that's closer to where they live and where they work and so on. And local governments also, might take very different approaches about how they're going to educate people. Is that through schools? Is that through a university? In the case of a city like Bologna that has the university as a prominent part of the city, is it through local television? But that's going to be very important, because, first of all, if people in a particular community do not accept the sort of introduction of self-driving vehicles, it's going to be very hard to have it go anywhere. Because active resistance or sort of unhappiness with that is going to be a significant problem. And second, without awareness that is widespread enough, you're going to have a lot more accidents, which will in turn then affect sort of how people receive or think about these sort of technologies. Every time there's an accident, there's bound to be, of course, a lot of people upset about, okay, why do we have these vehicles? Shouldn't we be having less of them? And so on, because there's been some sort of problem. Okay, now, the next thing. There are many different ways in which you could imagine furthering self-driving technology. And cities have a certain amount of flexibility in how they might try to achieve that goal. Let's give some examples, okay? I mentioned earlier, cities have a lot of municipal vehicles, buses, ambulances, fire vehicles, police vehicles, things for other people who are working for the city. Okay, one approach would be to say the city is going to have more of its own vehicles be self-driving, but not private vehicles. Right? So one approach a city could take is say, look, we're interested in self-driving cars, but we're only going to do it for municipal vehicles because we can control then exactly what we get, how they work, without having to deal with regulating private companies or private individuals. And you can imagine the fleet of cars that a city would have would be large enough to yield some benefits for having self-driving, but also be something of a controlled experiment that they can look at for some time before they decide whether they want to broaden it out or not. So it would be no different than saying that cities might choose to have, for example, electric vehicles for their buses, or natural gas, or other sorts of things that are trying to reduce the carbon footprint. And to say, okay, we're going to do that not by regulating private vehicles, but by simply providing an example by having our municipal vehicle fleet, which does contribute a significant amount to traffic in a particular place, to be converted in that way. Okay. A second model, though, is a kind of public-private partnership. So you could imagine that instead of restricting self-driving to municipal vehicles, you could say, well, we're going to have taxis, for example, that are self-driving, but we're going to do that in a highly regulated way, right? Whereby you have a particular taxi service that is essentially a business partner or has a local monopoly. And well, okay, through that, we're going to do self-driving. And so then, okay, it's not just municipal vehicles, and it does allow for individuals to try it out in a controlled way, but with significant controls by the local government. Now, for example, San Francisco has had for some time self-driving taxi services operating in the city. Two different ones. They're highly regulated. There's only a certain number of them. I'm actually going there next month, and another thing I hope to do is try one of those. In some ways, that seems a little more appealing than doing it in my own car, only because if something goes wrong, it's not on me. But anyway, so okay, and that can be expanded, contracted in response to sort of what results they get. How many accidents are there? Does it seem to be causing traffic problems? Right? Because it might be, the safety issues are not just about does the self-driving vehicle get into an accident. It could also just be the self-driving vehicle stops in the middle of an intersection, doesn't really seem to understand kind of what's going on with the traffic, and so then you cause more traffic problems, right? So you could just say, well, let's see how it works from that standpoint. Okay, now that's another model that cities could follow. Okay, a third model would be more of a direct private model where you say, look, there can be self-driving cars privately owned within our city so long as you meet certain requirements, right? So then it has nothing to do with something operated by or operated in connection with the local government. It could just be, we're just going to allow private people to have them and to operate them as long as they meet certain conditions. Okay, cities can try all of these different approaches in different forms, right? Again, in a way that's more problematic if a national or regional government were to mandate that cities had to have self-driving vehicles for their municipal services. That would be, I think, something that would meet a lot of objections by cities that don't want that or don't want to be told what kind of municipal vehicles or how their municipal services should be run. And so you can see that cities have these options because there are many different sort of services that they are directly providing, that they are indirectly providing, and that they otherwise interact with through regulation. Okay, next thing is, for self-driving to work, we have to have rules about what the human drivers are supposed to be responsible for when the vehicle is in a self-driving mode. Now, for example, when I go and try my Tesla self-driving, the instructions are from Tesla, right? Because there is no local regulation of this that I'm aware of. Okay, first, you have to be awake. 1, 2, you have to have your hands around the wheel, right? So the wheel is going to be spinning, the steering wheel, but you have to have your hands there in case you need to take control back because something's going wrong or you don't like something the self-driving vehicle is doing. Okay, now, as self-driving vehicles get better, you can imagine that, well, cities might have different approaches to the question of what is a human driver supposed to do, or where must they be in the car? Do they have to be in the driver's seat? Okay, or can they be in the passenger seat? Can they be in the back? Right? Do they have to sort of take control of certain things? For example, you might think the self-driving vehicle would be particularly good at parking because it's a fairly limited space and nothing's moving around it. So it's just backing the car into a particular place. Okay, as against being on a highway or being in some particular zone. So you can imagine rules that would say things like, when you're near a school, the human driver has to be in control of the car, right? Or when you're near some sensitive place. Okay, the point is, yes, driver's licenses are typically not something that a municipality or a city gives. Typically that is done more at a regional level or national level. So that's like one exception to the idea that cities take the lead in driving and traffic regulation. But you might imagine that you could have more local variations on that when it comes to self-driving vehicles, because the vehicle itself may need to get a license, right? That it's safe to operate in a certain self-driving autonomous way, but also add on to that different rules about the responsibilities of the human driver when the car is in a self-driving mode. And again, yes, you can imagine a national or regional rule about what a person is supposed to do when the car is self-driving. But again, that runs into the problem of, well, but there are lots of different circumstances that would arise. And do you really want to have one rule for all of that? Especially, and this is going to lead me to my next point, when we don't know a lot, or there's a lot we still have to learn about how self-driving vehicles will interact with other vehicles and with people doing other things. Okay. Now, to that point, the biggest obstacle to self-driving vehicles and their adoption is insufficient data, right? So in order for the cars to become very good at driving, they need many, many kilometers of driving under all sorts of conditions, weather conditions, traffic conditions, and so on. Well, how do you do that? The answer is you have to convince people to have self-driving vehicles, right? They can't learn enough simply through tests conducted by the auto manufacturers. That's not going to produce enough data. And it's also not going to create the necessary comfort level with the technology that would be necessary for people to want to adopt it. So it's there's a bit of a circularity here. In other words, for people to want to use self-driving vehicles, they have to be comfortable that they'll work well. But in order for them to work well, they have to be able to drive enough to gather enough information in order to be effective at driving. How do you kind of get that to a level where that will all happen? Now, it's an interesting question because I've done a little bit of research in the past on the history of airplanes and passenger planes. And you can think about that for a moment. You know, at some point after planes were invented and passenger planes were introduced, well, somebody had to be among the first to actually buy a plane ticket and go on a passenger plane. You know, some wealthy person, no doubt, because it would have been very expensive at the time. Well, what made them confident that this plane was going to fly or work properly? Now, there are always some people, and people who study technology have broken this down into kind of three groups, right? And some of you can think about like which of these groups you might belong to. So there are some people who are very excited about using whatever the new technology is. They want to be the first person to have something, like whatever, you know, could be the iPhone or Apple goggles or whatever the technology, they want to be, and they recognize it won't work that well. It'll have problems, but they want to be kind of on the cutting edge of whatever the new technology is. Okay, then there's a second group of people. They're sort of interested, but they want to see first what happens to the people who use it initially, right? They want to see how things go with the people who are the early adopters, right? Does the technology kill them, or do something bad to them, or does it seem to be working out okay? And then, if it seems to be working out okay for long enough, then they're happy to get it, right? And then the third group are people who are just much more resistant. They're not going to use this technology until they're like completely convinced that it's safe or effective, that sort of thing, right? And by the way, you can see, even for some of you, if you think about the pandemic again, vaccines sort of work that way too. Some people were very eager to get it as soon as possible. Other people were a little more like, well, let me see how, if any of them get ill or has a problem, and then I'll get it. And then others, were much more reluctant to get it, right? Okay. So when you think about that, you could say, all right, I don't know at what point people became confident enough in planes to want to fly in them. But what I do know is that the more people flew in them, the better they got. Because pilots learned more, airline technicians learned more, engineers learned more, and so on. Okay, now, here's the thing. If we have national or regional policies about self-driving vehicles, there will be fewer experiments by virtue of the fact that there will be fewer decision makers, right? If each country has a policy, there are only so many countries, and you'll get maybe 100 or 150 different approaches, right? If you allow cities to each adopt their own approach, you will have thousands of experiments. And this is one area where we probably want more experiments. It's a bit like a market, to say, look, the advantage of a market system for certain things is that it allows many, many experiments to be tried. Most will fail, but out of that large group, a few will do well, and then people will realize that that's the best way to make a product, and will gravitate towards that. But you might not learn that unless you have just a very large set of experiments and attempts to begin with. So for self-driving vehicles, there's something similar. Since we don't know a lot about how they're going to work, what problems we're going to encounter, the more experiments we can run, the better. And these experiments can only be run with real people in real places. They can't be run in a laboratory or in this kind of theoretical way, right? Like for mathematics or something. So having cities take the lead is the best way to get to this, and will speed up the adoption of these technologies, because there will be more experiments, there will be more self-driving vehicles on the road, and the comfort level will be reached faster than would be the case if you were to restrict it more to the national or regional level. Now, of course, a drawback of this, right, as with all experiments, is, well, as I said, many will fail. So some cities will pick a poor policy or make a poor choice about some aspect of self-driving car regulation, whether it's about what the human driver should do, or what, weather conditions they can tolerate, or what geographical conditions they can tolerate. They might be too aggressive and end up in a situation where you have more accidents. And of course, those accidents could lead to people being injured or killed. but there's really no other way. So someone pointed out recently, well, when a self-driving vehicle goes on the highway and is driving at a fast speed, okay, with a lot of traffic moving around, isn't that a risk to others or to the people in the car? And the answer is yes, but how else are they going to learn? Right? How else is the car going to learn how to navigate that unless it does it? And of course, initially when it does it, there's more of a risk of an accident. Now, right now, it's fair to say that the proportion of vehicles that are self-driving is so small, right? And it's still seen as basically experimental, that it hasn't really led to much criticism or sort of resistance to having them there, except in the, when you do have an accident, some people will say, oh, well, gee, what should we do about that? Which is an important question, who should be liable and under what standard, right? And that's something I talked about last year in my talk. But so far, you haven't seen much resistance to just having self-driving vehicles on the roads at all. But there will probably come a point when there will be enough of them that people will then begin to perceive it as a real hazard and may not like it at that point, once they see it as something more likely to actually affect them in their own driving or their own sort of moving around in a particular area. So I think that we can anticipate that there will be more of a discussion publicly about the limits of self-driving vehicles and what they should provide or what we should allow. I was in a conversation recently with a lawmaker in a state here in the United States, a different state, where they were in the process of discussing sort of just the initial regulatory framework for self-driving vehicles. Now, they were discussing it at a state regional level. He didn't see, as a lawmaker in a state and regional government, he didn't seem so enthusiastic about leaving it to cities, but you can understand why that might be the case. But this is an active subject of discussion, and it could come upon us very quickly. To take an example, I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, nobody was talking about AI, except in a very kind of science fiction, kind of abstract way. Now everybody's talking about AI. And that happened very suddenly because it kind of crossed the threshold from a kind of theoretical or academic concept to one that people realized was actually going to affect their lives, right, in all sorts of ways. And then there was a certain amount of alarm at that, right, which has now prompted, further discussions about how we should regulate AI. And the EU is working on that, the US is working on that, and that will, also play out. But the difference is that AI, as a general matter, doesn't have the same sort of physical and daily, obvious, visible component that self-driving vehicles do. That when things are more visible, they tend to produce more of a response or a reaction. So, in summary, I will say that we are in a exciting time. I mean, I think I'm hopeful that in my lifetime we will see self-driving vehicles widely adopted. And there are enormous benefits that will come from that, both in terms of reducing road accidents, increasing productivity, and generally, making people's lives easier in many, many ways, especially for people who are unable to drive now because they may have issues with physical disability, their eyesight is not good, and so on. And imagine just what a self-driving vehicle can do for someone like that to open up their lives and expand it. But to get there, we're going to need to make thoughtful, intelligent decisions about regulation, recognizing that we don't know a lot. It's a very complex field, and there's a lot to learn, and trial by error is really the only way that we can navigate that successfully. And the best place to go is the same place we go when we try to decide what the speed limit should be, or what the parking rules should be, or whether a street should be one way or have a traffic circle. All of those decisions we leave to local governments typically, and city governments. And that's worked out pretty well. Nobody really thinks that we need to have a major change in the way traffic laws are handled or traffic regulation is handled. So I think that here there is every reason to think that cities will do this job well, and that we'll learn the most, the fastest, by having cities take the lead. So I think for that I will stop, and then I can take questions. Or if Professor MUREDEN has thoughts or comments, I would be interested to hear those as well. I think you are on mute. Oh, okay, I'm not hearing you.
Okay, thank you for a very, very interesting lesson in which we have seen a lot of very interesting issues. For example, the first one, we did see it also in the Italian version of this seminar through the point of view of a psychologist. And so how many do the driverless car better if compared with the human being in seeing the signals? Because this is one of the things we discussed. So the capacity to see better signals on the one end, but on the other end, she needed to have very good made signals, and so the problem of the vehicle to infrastructure interaction. Second one, very interesting, is the problem of the public education. So how can the person be put in the condition to do his best in order to exploit the safety of the self-driving car? So for example, which are the new rules for the pedestrian or the cyclist or even the car drivers in order to exploit at best the car which is safer if compared with the traditional one? And the last very interesting thing is how to manage with I think the era of experiments, and so how to regulate the balance between we want to have a quick deployment of driverless car on the one end, but on the other end, we have to assess properly the risk. And so how has the legislator to deal with this phenomenon? So all these questions are very interesting. And so for a while, I asked to the students which are enthusiastic about this lesson if they want to ask something about that, if they have any curiosity or doubt about this subject and other things connected with the driverless cars. If you like, you can also come here and have a direct speech with Professor Magliocca.
Thank you, Professor. It was a lovely lecture. I wanted to ask that organizations such as Tesla, who make their cars according to a particular country, but I come from India, wherein the traffic rules and the people, how the people behave, like you just said, like the driving is already very erratic. And you said when you log into your Tesla, it gives you a specific prompts. So do you think such private car companies would be able to adapt to such situations and like whatever governmental laws that come out, like will they be able to adapt in that way their new cars? Like already it's such a difficult task for automated cars, and then adapting the same situation in very different environment. Like American laws are still strict, but Indian laws, traffic laws are not that strict. Like people break red lights like anything because the fines are not that heavy, or like there are even cows moving on the road. So something like that.
Right. So, yeah. Now, one difficulty, right, and I think, I think let me back up and say that I think people have been somewhat surprised that it's taken maybe longer than they thought it would for the self-driving technology to advance, right? So I think 5 or 10 years ago, people were a little more optimistic that we would already be at a point of having more self-driving vehicles on the roads. Okay, so what is the difficulty? So the difficulty in part is that first, driving is cultural, and that varies a lot, not only from country to country, but sometimes from city to city. Now, in other words, if I asked any of you to drive somewhere else, you could, but you would have to adapt, right? You'd have to kind of spend some time getting used to how fast people were going or what people were doing, let's say at a traffic circle and so on. It wouldn't be the same as what you were used to. Okay, now how do you get software to understand that, right? How do you get an AI to understand that? Okay, so one issue is, well, okay, if the AI is being used in a particular locality and can understand that, okay, that matters in some way that they're supposed to understand, and then when they go somewhere else, it's different, or it could be different. That's one thing that could be an issue. Now, a second issue, and kind of mentioned, as Professor MUREDEN mentioned, this sort of idea of psychology and sort of thinking about responses. And this is kind of a problem, is that a person might well understand that other people will not follow the rules, right? So there is a rule, but okay, in a certain situation, we understand either for good reasons or not, that others will not follow the rule. They're going to do something else. All right, but how do you get artificial intelligence to understand that? Because it can understand the rule, right, and the application of the rule to a particular situation, but it's going to have a harder time understanding that someone else is going to go through a red light, or is not going to stop, or is going out of turn, let's say. Okay. So that's a problem that may not be solvable just by saying, well, the culture is a certain way here and a certain way there, but it's really more about individual responses. Now, you can understand an attempt anyway by a city to say, look, because we have self-driving vehicles on the roads, or if you encounter a self-driving vehicle, like here's kind of a rule of thumb about what you should do or what you shouldn't do, because this is what it's going to anticipate when it sees a person crossing the street, for example. Okay? So that's part of why the public education campaign might help, to just get everybody sort of in a more similar mindset as to what the car is going to think and what the person's going to think. That said, though, that's not going to work for a lot of situations. I think, manufacturers have to adapt to different national regulations all the time with respect to products. And that they would prefer not to have, but they have to navigate that. And I think they will be able to navigate this as well once they get to some threshold of the technology being able to recognize also on its own that it's different driving in one place than another. And you could even imagine different varieties of software that would sort of facilitate that, just as you can have like different sort of people talking to you on a GPS, you know, in a different voice, a different language, right? I mean, you could imagine an adaptation that way. But so thank you for the question. And yeah, I mean, the culture of driving is a very interesting thing that, again, we don't think about unless we're taken to a foreign country and we have to drive there, right? Or we start thinking about how a machine would understand it.
Thank you, Professor. It was a lovely answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. If any other person like to ask something or have some curiosity or doubts, you're welcome. Yes.
Good afternoon. It's actually more of a comment. I was thinking about how I agree that these changes would be better made if made within the city's legislative process. But at the same time, I keep thinking if it would be worth doing it, especially when I'm seeing my background. I'm from Brazil, from São Paulo. So would it be like a worth of a change when these vehicles are not accessible yet for most people? So I feel like the point of making these big changes in the city to use the vehicles, the automated vehicles, would have to come also with the accessibility of it, because otherwise we're going to be making big changes in the city where people might need maybe just normal public transportation and not automotive vehicles. So I don't know, I think that the point why in some countries this seems like a far reality is because thinking about São Paulo, we haven't even solved the problem in public transportation yet. So think about something that technological, it's almost like a movie in general. So I don't know, like how accessible are these vehicles? Are they gonna be more accessible if we make these changes? I don't know, like I have no idea of how it will work, honestly.
Right. No, and I think that's right. Now, of course, one answer is that some cities may just reject self-driving vehicles entirely. And that is a consequence of saying that cities should be driving the policy. Now, obviously, if you say, well, if that happens, well, then you're not getting any data, right, or experiment. But I think that's a necessary consequence of giving them the freedom to choose among different alternatives. And sure, it is the case that either because of pollution or because of congestion, you know, because a major objection, right, to self-driving vehicles is, well, then we'll have more cars. No, and so, well, we really shouldn't be doing that. We should be investing more in mass transit. Okay, so, I mean, I think that's a valid concern. But again, you might say, well, some places are going to have different responses to that, right? Some are going to weigh that more heavily and are going to say, with our limited resources, we want to invest more in buses, for example, right? I mean, now the buses could also be self-driving, of course, right? They're experimenting with that, I know, in South Korea, for example. But you know, you could say, okay, that's a concern that can be taken into account. Now, the other thing to point out, of course, eventually is self-driving vehicles would mean certain fields or people would lose their jobs, right? I mean, if your job is you're a truck driver or a lorry driver, and well, it could really drive itself such that you don't really need to do much of anything when you're in the vehicle. It may not eliminate that job entirely, but it would certainly drive down the wage that the person would be paid, right? Because they're just anybody can do it. And then at that point, you could say, well, all right, that has to be weighed, that unemployment, basically, against the benefits. So again, different cities might have different responses to that too. So, I mean, I think that, yes, I think a city could simply say, we were not going to have any of this, you know, which is basically just another way of saying maybe they want to see how experiments go in a neighboring city before they decide to adopt something, which is fine. And I think also is respectful of legitimate concerns about safety, because the one thing we don't want to do, I think, is to say, oh, well, if you're concerned about the safety of these vehicles, you're just some anti-technology backward person, you know, because that's often the claim that people who care or are excited about the technology will say to, you know, people who are saying, well, I don't know, I'm not so sure, right? And of course, it's not true to say that someone is sort of against technology because they have concerns about a new technology, right? And so I think that's a way of accommodating that. Maybe that is better than having a national or regional policy. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have perhaps a last question or... Okay. I don't know. The question was similar to the previous, and so you already gave the answer because the subsequent question was more or less similar to the question we have heard 5 minutes ago. So, yes, if you like, we have another question again.
Hi, thank you for the lesson. I was wondering, I also agree with the regulation on a more specific point of view in the cities, for example. And I understood that from your point of view, the regulation, it should be like made by the cities generally. But I think this is like the best view, for example. But in a case of not cities adopting these regulations, would you think that it would be better to have a national regulation on it or not a regulation at all? Because I was thinking of the impacts that this decision of doing regulations on a national point of view or not doing a regulation at all could impact in the, for example, legal security or in the sense of decisions by the courts. Because I was also wondering that maybe countries from civil law traditions and common law traditions can give a different approach to this. So I don't know if the question is clear.
Yes, no, I mean, look, it's true that I come from a common law tradition. And so the idea of having many different decision makers sort of act and then taking time to observe how that works and then from that sort of deriving some principle, right? That is essentially a common law method of reasoning, right? So you might say, well, yeah, that's no wonder it's more appealing to me than sort of a top-down kind of deductive version. Okay. Now, you could imagine a kind of compromise of sorts between these two things in the sense of saying, look, maybe we need a period of time where these local governments do these experiments, and then national authorities can say, okay, we've seen enough information that we can now make a national policy. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, you know, and okay, and now we feel confident enough that we can have a national policy, right? And okay, a civil law country might want to do that more, or might be inclined to do that more quickly than a common law country, where they might be happy to just keep having the local experiments going on for a long time. I mean, also, of course, in some countries, just getting a national policy in place is just more difficult, right, politically. And so they may have to go with local things because they can't get a national policy through. So, I mean, I think that's right. I guess the question is sort of, okay, how quickly can you develop a national policy that makes sense, right? And beyond some very basic things, like simply saying it's permitted to have them at all, right? You could say, okay, that could be a national policy. And you could also imagine it working in some cooperation with manufacturers who may be working on the technology and want some government guarantees for maybe about their liability or about funding or other things. So I think that's a valid point. It's just that the consequences of making a bad national policy, right, are greater than the consequences of a bad local policy in any particular city. And so it's probably where's the comfort level? At what point do you feel confident enough that you can have a national policy at all, right? And if you say, okay, well, I feel confident now. I mean, after all, some countries, right, you might say conditions from city to city might be closer to each other than they would be for other countries. So maybe, you know, if it's, I mean, not to pick any particular country, but just to say, okay, yes, there are differences between our major cities, but they're not that great. So, well, once we've seen some experimenting, we feel pretty confident, as against much wider difference, where you might say, well, we need more time or we need more study. So yes, I guess it is true that this is more of a common law friendly approach to the problem, which, yeah, something one would have to consider. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much for this lesson, which was extremely appreciated and extremely interesting. And so perhaps we will have in the future a second meeting, perhaps, because we will continue with this course. It was really a privilege to hear your lesson and also to be again together in Bologna University. But we all hope to see you in person very soon.
Thank you. I hope so too. Ciao.
So, bye. Thank you very much. Thank you.